you also explore, why do people destroy other people's lives? You know, how do you make a life? Why do you destroy? So those are almost those polarities of like destruction and creativity.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about, because you write about topics that are still live issues, as it were. You know, hugely important topics like the refugee crisis. I know that when you began writing it, you didn't even see it as a story of refugees. You saw it as a story of two young people crossing the world, like a road trip.
Yeah.
The compulsory
The
road
quest.
trip. But in the past, I mean, since the book was published, my gosh, I mean, the situation has
exploded.
Right. So.
I think when I was writing journalism, and when I was writing fiction, we could all see it coming. Like I would say this in my newsroom as well. You know, this is the story of now. This is not going to go away. This is the next big thing we as cultures, societies, countries, nations are going to have to deal with. You know, and it was. I was kind of almost surprised at the reaction when the Syrian refugee crisis broke, and everyone said, "Oh, there's a crisis! There's more people than ever before are crossing our borders." And like, to me, I couldn't. Like, it wasn't a crisis. The only crisis was a crisis of unpreparedness within Europe. Like, of course, you could see this coming. You know, war had been raging in Syria. It was just incredible that the borders hadn't spilled over sooner. You know, and it was. I don't know. It was very odd to. I guess you write these things wanting to alert people, you know, and then also, so to get into the politics a bit more of it. It wasn't that I chose political subjects, but in a sense they were things that felt urgent to me that had to be talked about, and the political climate was such that it was very difficult to talk about. It was very, very polarized. In France, it was incredibly polarized. Bitter and nasty, the debate and what was going on, and going back to my point about wanting to speak about this in a calm, quiet way, and I wanted to launch this little book out there, and it's amazing. You know, I had incredible responses from readers. I had a doctor in Bradford. I had a message from a doctor in Bradford who he thanked me for the book. I was saying, why is a doctor Bradford reading even this book? And he said these Afghan kids presenting at his hospital with these incredible injuries, and he couldn't understand, because they couldn't speak enough English to explain to him, he couldn't understand where the injuries had come from, why they had this, you know, because they've been falling off the backs of trucks, and they've been on at Calais trying to scramble on and getting run over, and, you know, horrible things, burns, and, you know. And so I felt like, okay, you know, this book has done some good. If it's only one reader and it's only this guy, it's gone where it needed to go, you know. And that was very gratifying. But I've had many other responses too from other people who felt that the eyes have been opened. What I was worried would be that it would be seen as polemical and taking a side and taking a point of view. And I think it's something to do with, we could talk a bit about the context of political books, or context of novels in a political time. Maybe all times are political, I don't know, but or picking an issue that seemed, that became so topical, and suddenly it's seen as grinding an axe, perhaps. Whereas I was trying to get in the middle and get into the humanity of it, and the motivations, and what actually these people we might see on our streets have been through, what their journey has been till now. And so I feel anxious and unhappy with the label political, but maybe that's just something I'm not facing. Maybe they are political books and I just need to get over myself or something.
You show so well how the political affects the personal, vice versa, how the personal is inextricably entangled with the political, which is something we're all only really realising in the past year. You know, it's really hitting us hard that the political is personal and the personal is political. It's so difficult to extricate the two. So, and I thought you did that beautifully, you know, with these astonishing characters. Politics is affecting them to their core.
And in fact, without them wanting it, you know, it comes and finds you. It has a nasty way. But and also in our contemporary times, you know, where we're seeing, you know, separatist politics and supremacist politics and identity politics, and, you know, everything's being divided and divided and divided. And I don't know how this kind of relates, but in Argentina, I met a journalist on the radio who was a wonderful, helpful person to me, and he said one thing. he was very involved in the theatre, and he'd done a book on talking to children and what their memories were of the dictatorship just when it ended. And he said to me, there's one thing that always stuck with me. He said, we have to be aware of our inner Nazi. And it's like we all have this ability to be extreme and to be authoritarian and to be intolerant of others. It's not just them. Like we all have it in us. And I sometimes wonder whether that's what's happening at the moment, where we're talking about censorship of views and opinions and the sensitivities left, right and centre. It's such a minefield to be a writer in right now. Anyone in the arts and in comedy and in painting, and these issues are bubbling up like never before, and we just have to be careful that it doesn't tip over into something censoring and silencing.
Right. And another issue that's really bubbling up that's so relevant to your work is this issue of fake news, conspiracy theories, which in the past year, wow, the terrain of journalism has changed. I mean, we no longer really expect journalism to be giving us the truth, and we know when the leader of the most powerful country in the world is censoring press conferences and so on. Is that something that you've felt? I mean, it makes the truth of fiction even more pressing.
I think it opens a field for fiction, because sometimes we turn to fiction because what can we trust? And I think what fiction does is, I was trying to think about how to express this. That I think fiction, it gets to truth in a different way. It gives you the long term, or the genesis, or the perspective, or the points of view. It gives you, and it boils down to something quite often elemental. Whereas what we get in our day-to-day news is, this has happened, that has happened, it fits this narrative, it fits that narrative, it subverts this one, it subverts that one. And fiction gets at the nub of things in a different way, I think. But I don't know, in some ways, I wouldn't say that it's all over for journalism. I think we've always lived with fake news, but we've never called it fake news.
Right. That's a really excellent point, actually.
We've had we've had tabloids coming out with, refugees eat our swans or something. What was that? Some of the headlines that have been pretty incredible. So we've always had it. And journalism, true, good journalism, my formation was in Reuters, where, it was very nuts and bolts, nothing that's happening right now is anything that type of news can't cope with. You check your sources, you can't check your sources, and that's what they're doing. There was, I don't want to go into too many specific details, but the one about how many people showed up at the inauguration, and then Reuters said, well, here's our photos, and then there's all this fake news, well, actually, we can defend, this is a photographer, and this is what and we just have to keep cool, and keep doing what we know how to do. And I think we have a sense of what is truth, and we need to keep our critical facilities sharpened, and we need to question things, because we've always had things shoved down our throats that have been false, it's turned out, and there's always been big, powerful interests. You think of tobacco lobbies and health industry. It's very hard to always know what is truthful, and that's never changed. So we as citizens have to be as sharp as we've ever been. And take everything that comes out of the White House with a pinch of salt.
Yeah. I mean, that example about the photographs of the inauguration is so interesting, because you've also have a book, War on Photography.
Oh I did a book on photography.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Before opening up to the audience, because I'm sure you have plenty of questions, I wanted to ask about storytelling and narrative when it comes to conflict, because you spoke about the importance of storytelling and revisiting painful periods of history, and obviously journalism and fiction writing are both involved in telling a story in a way, in a very different way, and narrative. And how do you find, what are the different potentialities of narrative, both forms, and how can they both tackle conflict in the form of storytelling? If that question makes sense.
No, I think what interests me personally, and probably also when I was working as a journalist, but as a fiction writer, is what happens when the cameras move on? What do people, there's journalism alerts us to stuff, but it doesn't get in, it can't. There's too many demands on it. The world is too vast, too much is happening. What happens to the people affected by those headline stories? That's kind of what I'm interested in. I think what's left, and in terms of what does conflict do to people? How do people overcome it or live with it? But there is an issue with constantly raking over deep-seated problems of the past. Like, this is something that came up in the Balkans, and I think what was the name of the writer? Susan Sontag's son, Reef, I forget his first name, has written quite eloquently about this, about taking up grievances, like national and ethnic grievances from the past, from sometimes, some centuries before, old battles and so on, and bringing up that history is full of terrible things that have happened. Where do we draw the line? We have to live with what we've got. So I think we have to be careful of harping on about deep ancient things, but when they haven't been dealt with, I think it's that. When they haven't been dealt with, I think they need to be brought to the surface. And things like Spain's never really come to terms with what happened in the Civil War, and there's I don't know how quite it connects with Catalonia at the moment, but I know that the Franco era kept a lot of that separatist desire under, and so things are surging up now. And in Argentina it was the same. That what fascinated me in this story was that young people in their 30s or 40s who were barely alive during the dictatorship, their first year of life or second, could have this past dictatorship surge up into their life and turn their personal life utterly on its head. So things have to be talked about. And a country like Australia too, where I come from, is not at ease with its past, and we need to really look at it and make our peace with it and say, even saying sorry is never enough really, but there has to be acknowledgement. I think fiction can do that amazingly well.
And you mentioned your interest in documenting what happens when the cameras move on in that space which is undocumented. You were the first journalist to really cover the story of these unaccompanied children. It's absolutely extraordinary that people were unaware of this beforehand. And is there a point that do you remember a specific incident or point when you realised that journalism wasn't enough? Or was it an accumulation of...
I think it was having done the journalism, getting to that point, and then realising that there was no more I could do in that field that would change opinion. And then what do? Do you become an activist, or do you, found an NGO, or do you? And I didn't feel that I had talents in that area, but I thought I could write. So I do what I can do, and also you have to pass the baton, because you can't be hammering on after a while, when the second the big Syrian crisis, as we call it, happened, and I felt like, I know this inside out, I can talk about it, and I realized I've got to let other people take it up now, because I've said what I need to say, and I personally had to move on from it because it was becoming my life, and I had to get back, because it's very draining and demanding. But I don't know.
In terms of giving voice to the voiceless, and
that's a funny concept, because they have voices. It's not like voices. They don't have.
Arundhati Roy quote about that.
Yeah. And I've used it myself, and then later I was thinking about, actually, they do have voice. Like, it's a little bit, am I being patronising by saying...
So the Arundhati Roy quote is that everybody has a voice, it's just that some are unheard.
Yeah, some are not listened to.
Right, yes.
But I wanted to tell the story as a whole. It's almost like a holding pattern, so they can tell their story when the time comes, and they will, and they're starting to. So, but I felt it was urgent that it be known about and said.
Yeah.
And then, and I, in a sense... I don't know, I had to be careful. There's all these issues around appropriation of identities. And here I am, I'm not Afghan, I'm not a boy, I'm not on the journey. And I have a little bit of an ethical problem about the type of journalism which will go on that journey because they can, and because they've got a camera and a TV crew and a company behind them. Let's follow them on their journey. It's like these people are doing it to save their lives, and we're doing it for fun, or because to build our career, or to get paid for it, or, it's all very compromising, I think. I forget what I was trying to say at the beginning of that sentence.
Well, a really interesting point about
appropriation of voices,
Right, which comes back to this issue of
identity,
and also empathy.
Yeah. I feel that we should be able to, but you have to do it well as you possibly can, to the last ounce of your conscience. Do it well, and not superficially. Don't caricature, don't stereotype, but try and do it with integrity, because fiction's always done that. That's what fiction writers do. You know, women write about men.
Yeah.
Can I only write about white Australian females of the age of, you know, that's like, it's so limiting
Which just
and not
comes
interesting.
Right, and also we were talking about what fiction can do that journalism can't. You're not writing a first-person piece about yourself, you're writing a work of fiction.
Yeah.
Which is the beauty of fiction.
Yeah, exactly. You kind of project your things into someone else's mould. Yeah.
Well,
anyway.
Caroline, thank you so much for
Thank you.
a fascinating discussion. I'm sure I can keep you talking all evening, but I won't,
Great
because I'm sure our audience will have lots of questions for you.
I don't know.
So if you do have a question,
you might have
don't be shy.
Talk them out of
This
questions.
is your moment to ask.
Got a microphone for anyone.
Yes, there's a very good mic, so
You want to have a question?
raise your hand.
Yeah, there's one.
Hi, thank you. I have a question about, on a practical level, how do you cope with all the difficult things that you have to kind of,
absorb,
learn about? And I mean, on a daily basis, that all this is in your head, and I find it very difficult to just, you know, keep going doing other stuff, but even tackling it. How do you do it?
I suppose you counterbalance. You know, friends are really important. It's good to remember that there are other concerns and other lives and other issues, and this is just one amongst many. Learning all the dark stuff in Argentina was very disturbing after a while, and I was at a certain point I just wanted to leave Argentina. I thought, I know enough. I don't want to know more. You know, it's time to go. And that was a relief in actually extricating myself from that place. Of course, I had the books that all accompanied me and all the words and thoughts and that. But there is, when in writing, there's kind of, when you've seen quite bad things, I almost felt I had a commitment to tell, and that was quite driving. And because I had something to do with that information, it wasn't just I would sit on it, absorb it, and it would flatten and depress and destroy me. It was something. It fueled me because it made me angry. I wanted to. So I suppose you turn the emotion into something you can use. I think that's, and then I tried to offset it with, and reading other things and listening to music and with friends and I don't know. I don't think I had a real strategy, but as a journalist, you know a lot of dark things go on, but it's when you specialize in something day after day, and that book took probably 4 years. I was working full time for some of it, and then I had a sabbatical for some of it, but I'm sort of thinking about that subject for 4 years, and I wanted to tell people because it's like I just learnt these terrible things, and you realize everyone else is on another wavelength altogether, and it's a bit odd that I'm so worked up about something that happened in Argentina 40 years ago, but still, I did have a bit of a burning desire to do something, to tell this incredible story the best way I could. So I made it motivating somehow.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
Do you think it would have been very different and almost impossible to do if it were about home? I mean, does it help to be talking about a place that's not?
That's a very interesting question. I sometimes wonder whether I'm not writing these things because I'm not writing about home. Like, as an Australian, I feel a bit ashamed about what's been going on in the refugee world over there. And I think I'm not there and I can't talk about it firsthand, so I talk about what I can. And it's not exactly by proxy, but I think I'm fired up about those issues because it resonates with me because I'm from somewhere else. You also have to be careful taking on other people's stories because there is this thing about, do you have a right to tell the story? It's an odd thing that I've never thought about, having to justify it. Because as a journalist, you're all the time, going into other people's worlds and talking about, terrible things that are happening there, or sometimes the good things too. And so it's not such a shock for me to do that. But there is a bit of a thing now that you almost have to have a personal investment in a story to be allowed to tell it. And I don't quite know where that's come from.
It's a false notion of authenticity.
Yeah, or someone's my grandparent did something, therefore I have the right now, 2 generations later, to talk about it because I have more skin in the game maybe, or I don't know. I don't like all these limitations. Like, I'm not Argentine. I've lived in Latin America and worked there in different parts of it. I wanted to write a story that would carry me, that was fascinating enough that I could last the distance learning new things. It had to have that fascination for me. So I plunged into it, and only later did I think, oh, maybe people will think it's a bit weird that I'm picking up a story that's not my own. But I wanted to bring that story into the light, or bring it into our universe, because we're going through quite extreme times in politics, and it's just as well to remember where extreme politics can sometimes lead. I suppose that's it.
Hi, thank you very much. Very, very interesting evening. Very good questions. Very good, very well answered. I think my question really follows on from that about the sort of right of a fiction writer to write what they damn well please, because it's fiction. As long as you're writing well enough, you earn that right, I think. But my specific question is, because you're writing about real history that is very tangible and affects people's lives, were there points? You know, everything is a truth if you're writing it well enough.
Right.
But were there points where either you were putting thoughts into a real historical character's voice, as it were, that was being fictionalised, or there were sort of inconvenient dates that, for the sake of the story, you kind of thought, yeah, that happened then, but I'm just going to shift it a few months because it suits the story better?
Yeah. The timeline question is, I'll start with that first. That's an interesting one. Hilary Mantel says you should keep the timeline and never flinch from, never sort of deviate from it, and use that as one of the constraints in your fiction. And I tried very hard, but I had something. I think I had 27 characters, or over 22 years, or 22 characters over. I had a spreadsheet for all the and their ages, and because each time I decided this bit should be there, then all the ages would change and the kids would no longer be kids, and it was, and the flowers on the jacaranda in the wrong seasons, and I had to keep. It was really, this is like how nuts I get about keeping the truth effect, if you like. I don't know. I think that there's a couple of points where I had to deviate from the timeline, and in the Memory Stones, and I've acknowledged that at the end. And there's very few, and it's where I needed something for fictional, I really needed it for fictional reasons, then I just came clean with it in the end. And I've been as honest as I can. I mean, I don't know if a reader will find something that's a little bit like off by a few months or something, but it is a bit of a problem when you start each chapter with a date line with a date on it, or a month, and you think, oh, now I have to really make sure that did happen. In the case of Hinterland, it was the opposite. I didn't have a timeline. In fact, I was writing very contemporaneously. So I was doing that research in 2009, and I had to think about when, given the age of the kids, when they would have been born, what was happening in Afghanistan. There was a big exodus of that. I had to know in my mind, although I didn't make it explicit in the book, what the ethnicity of those kids were, where they would have gone as refugees, and when UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Agency, would start to say it was safe for them to come back, when the family would have come back to Afghanistan, when the bombs were going off, when did things start getting tense and dangerous again, and then people were killed in the family. All the backstory I had to recreate from bits of news reports here and bits of human rights records there, and UNHCR reports which might come out, with a long time lag between the events happening. And that was very challenging, trying to establish the historical timeline. But I wasn't, to go back to your first question, I wasn't having to put, in the way Hilary Mantel imagines, Cromwell's whole life and personal life and history and thoughts. I created my characters, so there are real characters, sometimes real historical players are mentioned, but just, especially in Memory Stones, I mentioned, I think Videla gets a mention, I didn't want to mention them, because they were doing such awful things, but there you can work out who they are through descriptions. There's, in the beginning, the cartoons are being drawn, and you know who's being talked about. But they weren't my characters. My characters were ordinary people going through this stuff, so they were my own fabrication. But I gave them things that had happened to them had happened to real people. There's an element of extortion at one point, which just horrified me when I heard that it happened to numbers of people. That happens in the book. So I gave that to my characters. There's other things that I gave to my characters that I'd taken from other stories. But I didn't have to put words. It was more like I had to imagine what it would be like to be in X, Y, Z situation, and then fill that with my own knowledge of life, I suppose, as any writer does. You know. But the timeline's like, yeah, that can be a real challenge.
Thank you. Great question. Great
Yeah,
answer.
good questions. I think I've talked them all into a corner.
A lot of writers will say that they, sorry,
There's one at the back.
the feature one.
We'll come to you next.
Hang on, she's got the mic.
Fine, yeah.
Yeah. So it seems that there was a lot of decision making, what you can tell and what you can't tell. As you expressed that there were some things that were too terrible to share. So I was just wondering, was there a standard or a measure that you tried to set with yourself that what can I share and what should I not?
It's a good question. I don't think I had a standard as such. I think it was, I found myself not wanting to go near it because it was so distressing. Once I knew it, I didn't want, in memory stories especially, I didn't want to put it into words. I had to get over my own inhibition about that. And it needed to be, as my editor at the back said, I needed to put in, it had to be there, this, because I put in this section, it's sort of written like a weird kind of poem in a way. And I was a bit uncertain whether I should keep it in. And then we decided that it should be there because it needed to touch base. Otherwise, everything that's happening, all these characters are going through, it's not related to anything real. We needed to know the real deep motivation of what had happened and how horrible it was and what they were up against. So there was, I think the issue was getting over my not only my inhibition about it, but also how could I find the words? That was the hard thing. How to find the words to write it, because to describe torture and all that's very hard to read. I think it's very hard to do well, I think I could only come at it a bit obliquely and suggestively and allow the reader to imagine, but I couldn't put what was happening so directly down on the page because it wouldn't read well, it wouldn't be convincing, it might even sound false, I don't know. But I needed the reader's imagination had to work there, and I had to give them space for that. So, and in Hinterland, pretty bad things happened that I learnt about in my research, actually. The things, somebody said to me when I was writing it, she read a bit of, I gave her 2 little bits to read, and she said, "You're protecting your characters." I said, "Oh, God. I have to make bad things happen to them. I have to not spare, sometimes you have to put your characters through as much bad stuff as you can imagine and then have them come out. Like, you have to test your characters. I think they tell you that in creative writing class. You test your characters. It's like, oh, I don't want to test these little boys. It's like, stop protecting them. That was the protection that I felt in the real world, and let the stuff happen. And so some bad stuff had to happen to them. And it was, maybe I'm too coy about stuff like that, but it had to be in there to make it real, and not too much, because that's right, the important thing for me was this is ordinary, it's happening every day, it was happening all over Europe, and I didn't want to sensationalize it. That's the other thing about writing stories related to real people's experience. It felt voyeuristic, or using their stuff for my own novelistic purposes. It felt a bit bad, just felt bad taste, not even bad taste, just felt wrong somehow. I was uncomfortable with it. So I didn't want to exploit it, but it had to be in there. So I guess they're the sort of decisions that I was trying to make. Whether I succeeded or not, I don't know.
Thank you.
There was a question at the front
It's
here.
okay. Just a lot of writers will tell you that.
Hang on, get the mic so the
Yeah,
guys at the back can hear.
sorry. A lot of writers will tell you they're always writing about themselves.
Yeah.
Their characters are always projections of themselves, however old they are, whatever gender they are, whatever their occupation is and so on. But you're very definitely writing about other people in a way. So I just wondered where you are in all this.
Yeah. I think what I did was take people that are, yes, quite different from me in terms of age or cultural ethnicity and so on, but they're going through very human things, and we're all human. And though we have cultural differences and linguistic differences and age differences points of view that are a bit different. But there's some fundamental things. If a child is taken from you, I don't think it's a nationality issue around that. I think, I was careful in my interviews to try and pick up things that would make things feel authentic. So in the Argentine people are very European, as everyone says when they go to Argentina, compared to the rest of Latin America. And I felt that you'll notice a lot of the novel doesn't take place in Argentina. The beginnings of it doesn't, it's underpinned, and I go back to it, but it takes place in places that I know, a lot of it Mexico and places in Europe. My characters are in exile a lot of the time. So there were people that we could meet, that we could recognize. So, and I had to imagine, sometimes I felt out of my depth for sure, like having to imagine things that are way beyond my experience. But I thought, it's an artistic endeavor trying to create and imagine what that is like. And also some of these things were so extreme that who could say that it was wrong, as long as it was felt and it was plausible and psychologically plausible. It's a book that stretched me into really new areas because I had to imagine myself into so many different characters of different ages. Some we're much closer to than others. I think you put into it what you have and what you've learnt of the world and of life and what you imagine and what other writers you might read have done. And I don't know where we get it from film, from just being alive we get it. And we try to do our best by the characters that we've created, so that they're not offensive to people that might read that book and say, hey, you've misrepresented. You don't. That's the other thing when things are politically live, when they're political issues, you don't want people to be saying, you can feel you've got to make the good characters really good because they're good guys. That I wanted to avoid as well. And you feel, when you sympathize a lot, you want your good characters to not have any flaws and to be perfect. And that's a weakness, I think. I think I needed to give my characters in both books to make them flawed and human.
They're wonderfully complex.
Yeah, I hope I tried to make them humanly complex.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
Thank you. I read both of your books. I thought they were tremendous, and I think empathy is really at the heart of both of them. But on the issue of not being political, you say in the same breath that you want to change public opinion, and that's very interesting to talk about. I'm particularly thinking of Hinterland and how the issue of child refugees has been so much in the news, and how the book has been a springboard to working with NGOs or political groups, whether that has been a consequence of your writing as well.
Whether the book has been...
Well, whether the issues of child refugees, and that has been picked up by organisations, NGOs have worked with child refugees, and to what extent you've been drawn more into a political arena, if you like, as a result of...
because what was interesting with Hinterland was that there were NGOs already working, like Save the Children knew about it. There was a work group that included several UNHCR and Save the Children, and I forget the third one now. Like, people in the field knew about it and were working on it and were worked up about it. I had people to talk to when I did my articles, but it wasn't known in the media. It wasn't known by the general public. They weren't seen as a vulnerable group within this. So, in a sense, when I say that I didn't want it to be a political novel, I didn't want it to be seen as I'm taking a side